my misbegotten youth gave me a reputation as a street fighter, and once I got out of that situation, I decided to bring my street fighting into social justice issues and human rights issues. And over my 47 years as a journalist, that's basically where I've stayed, fighting for women's rights, for the abuse of women, fighting for children's rights and children who are in institutions and in the care of the state, and fighting for refugees and fighting for trafficked women. So that's where I've been literally most of my journalism career. I make targets and I go after the targets. I go after the bad guys and I go after people that are supposed to be in positions of power to do something about what is going on. And tonight what I'm going to do is talk about a situation that I know well from the inside and from the outside. What institutional life is all about, what happens to you when you come out, what it's like to be trafficked, and all of that kind of really, I guess, scuzzy stuff that goes on in society today. So I'm targeting something that I know really, really well, and something that I'm going to be talking about for the first time in detail. Now, we've all heard the age-old cliches mouthed over and over again, decades and decades, by politicians, that children are our most precious resource, our hope for the future. And we've heard the words uttered from the pulpits that children are a gift from God. Yet every single day, millions of children worldwide are abused, exploited, beaten, raped, and murdered. And when we hear about the heinous crimes committed against our most vulnerable, precious gifts from God, we are dutifully shocked and appalled, and we ask why, and we demand action. And yet, the slaughter continues, unabated. And this evening I'm going to talk about the incredible suffering, the unimaginable abuses, and the pain that takes place in the myriad orphanages and institutions warehousing tens of thousands of children in Ukraine. And that's one of the reasons I wrote Orphanage 41, and one of the reasons we're going to be watching a documentary a little later. And I'll begin by saying, what is happening to these children in Ukraine is a crime, and it's Ukraine's shame. And the government of Ukraine sits back and allows it to continue. Sure, politicians have promised action over there, especially when a tragedy is exposed or the conditions of these child warehouses are detailed in the news media. But keep in mind, politicians have been promising action for more than 2 decades since Ukraine achieved its independence, and in the end, their words are as empty and meaningless as their greedy, corrupt, stone-cold souls. Throughout Ukraine, huge numbers of impoverished children and mentally challenged and physically disabled children have been abandoned and locked away, out of sight and out of mind, from their families and their communities. Now, according to Mykola Kuleba, Ukraine's presidential ombudsman for children, he counts 109,000 children living in 751 institutions across the country, and that every 3 days, one of them dies. Kuleba says, quote, "A lot of children with disabilities die because they don't get the necessary medical support." He also notes that the number of children in care of the state is rising. On average, 250 kids enter the system each day, significantly more than the number graduating. And I'm going to get into the word graduating over there. The government now says there are 9,000 more children in internats, what they call the institutions over there, than there were 2 years ago. Inside these sprawling Dickensian institutions, young, innocent souls face an onslaught of psychological torment, physical abuse, and sexual violence. And the harsh reality is that these children are literally condemned to a life of abuse, isolation, and neglect. Graduates from these institutions across Ukraine have recounted chilling stories of their violent and degrading treatment while in the so-called care of the state, bullying, beatings, and rapes, all at the hands of sadistic staff and older kids. There are stories of forced labor, where children are made to work on farm fields for 10 and 12 hours a day on orphanage-owned farms or farms owned by locals who pay a fee to the orphanage staff to use these kids. And essentially what's going on here is child slave labor. Now, occasionally there appears on the steps of institutions the good-hearted, the well-intentioned orphanage-bound foreign tourists bearing much appreciated donations, most of which end up in the pockets of gluttonous directors and staff once they leave. Now, more insidious are the so-called tourists with cash in their pockets who simply want and get unfettered access to children, taking them away to host them for a day or two or a week at some secluded place. These are pedophiles who sexually abuse vulnerable children, or pornographers who take children away to videotape them for the child porn market, or sex traffickers who rent out the bodies of their terrified victims. And this occurs for one reason alone: cold hard cash made on the backs of vulnerable victims. Bottom line, for the most part, these orphanages, these so-called internats, are nothing more than dumping grounds, dangerous, soulless warehouses for children. They are vile institutions that cause irreversible and irreparable psychological, physical, and spiritual damage to all those forced to languish in them. So think about the state of that child when he or she is ready to leave this institution at 16, 17, or 18. The time when they age out and get this, what they call graduate. What do they have to look forward to? They are physical, psychological, and emotional messes. They are broken spirits and distrusting, angry souls. What a colossal farce, their graduation. Graduating with virtually no life skills, limited education, and totally unable to cope with life on the outside. And for these teenagers, the jarring adjustment from complete dependence to sudden independent adulthood is too much. When they leave these internats, government statistics have found that 90% of orphanage graduates are not prepared at all for independent living. Most don't even know how to fry an egg or boil pasta. They are not capable of even integrating into a community. Government statistics have found that 20% of children graduating internats at 16 end up in prison shortly after. 10% go on to commit suicide. Huge numbers turn to alcohol and drugs to deal with their miserable situation, and many go on to produce a new generation of abandoned children for the internats. And less than 1% make it to university. I've spoken to dozens of workers at these internats and scores of victims, the so-called graduates, and the runaways on the streets of Kiev and Lviv, and the men and women who today moved onto the prison system not long after they were turned out into society with just the clothes on their backs. Their chilling testimonials can fill tomes on the cruel treatment they received while in these institutions and orphanages. And after listening to accounts of their early life, their history, you can understand why so many are now in prison. Because as soon as they exit the orphanage system and the orphanage doors, or shortly after they hit the streets, they are targeted by organized crime gangs, recruited for criminal activities, or trafficked wholesale into the domestic and international sex trade. I remember going into a sprawling prison in Kolomea, a prison crammed with 5,000 inmates. And I asked the warden how many he estimated had gone through the orphanage system. And he said, at minimum, 85%. Later, I spoke to a random group of 35 inmates, and all but 2 raised their hands when I asked how many were graduates of that system. And for more than an hour, these individual inmates recounted stories of neglect, beatings, harsh corporal punishment, and sexual assault. Their eyes were filled with rage and anger, and yet in some I could see that glimmer of a frightened child. And one social worker told me, if you go to the train station in Kiev, you'll see women offering up young prostituted girls at the ages of 18 or under, and 80% of them are from internats. So I went, and that is precisely what I encountered. I was approached by a woman offering up girls, teenage girls, for sex. The reality and the unimaginable nightmare is that while growing up in the orphanage and internat system in Ukraine, so many of these children are sitting ducks for sex traffickers and pedophiles. And the very people entrusted to protect them, the directors and the staff of these places, are often complicit in the nefarious transactions with traffickers where innocent, vulnerable children are the commodity. A worker at a huge internat in Lviv told me that the staff don't care at all about the children. Oftentimes they say girls sneak out at night and come back in the morning, and sometimes the girls just leave and never return. And they don't care. They don't report them as missing. No one bothers to look for them. And sadly, Ukraine has earned an international reputation as being a hub for human trafficking, where orphaned and abandoned children are at extreme risk of being trafficked for sex, slave labor, and pornography. Keep in mind, by the time they are 10 years old, they're already hardened to the reality of sexual abuse within the institutions, and as a result, father for the sexual exploitation by the time they age out of these institutions at 17 and 18. And when I was doing research for the Natasha's book, I visited a rescue mission in the town of Lecce, and that's at the Stiletto Heel of Italy. I spoke to a number of young Ukrainian women who had been trafficked into the sex slave trade after exiting the orphanages. In Bosnia and Kosovo, I found teenage girls in brothels servicing United Nations peacekeepers. That's what their job was, 5,000 of them, servicing United Nations peacekeepers from the United States, from Canada, from Britain, from France, from Germany, from Italy, from Greece, from Spain. And they were there to protect people from what had happened in those countries. I've been told that child pornographers gaining access to institutions often get into those places to seek out their prey. I've been told by one notorious orphanage that ran a massage parlor in the basement of the facility where children were bought and sold for sex. Another orphanage director had girls standing on a road outside the institution servicing truck drivers. Moreover, what I have found is not a hidden, dirty little secret. The international community has been well aware of what is going on in these disgusting Ukrainian institutions for more than 16 years. The recently released 2018 U.S. State Department Trafficking in Persons report states that children institutionalized in state-run orphanages are especially vulnerable to trafficking. It goes on to say, officials of several state-run institutions and orphanages are allegedly complicit or willfully negligent in the sex and labor trafficking of girls and boys under their care. And the report concludes that the government of Ukraine does not fully meet the minimum standards for the elimination of trafficking. Now really, you think about that. The minimum standards, they don't even meet that. The report goes on to recommend strongly that Ukraine vigorously investigate and prosecute trafficking offenses, including public officials complicit in trafficking crimes, and ensure convictions, that the convictions result in proportionate and dissuasive sentences. And it notes, lax sentencing, likely aggravated by corruption, meant the majority of convicted traffickers avoid imprisonment, which was inadequate to deter trafficking in the first place. Now, this disturbing aspect of the 2018 State Department Trafficking in Persons report is that it is virtually identical to what they found in their report in 2017 and 2016 and every other report for the past 16 years. This is the finding in 2003. It's the first mention of Ukrainian orphanages since it began monitoring human trafficking in the year 2000. And it said, the growth of internal trafficking of young girls is a rising concern, as is the susceptibility of children in orphanages to traffickers. 2013, and yet this heinous crime against vulnerable children and women continues unabated. Now, here's an alarming statistic we just got. Since 1991, when Ukraine got its independence, there's an estimated 230,000 women have been trafficked out of that country into the sex trade. You'd have to ask yourself, what the hell are the men? Where are the protectors? Where are the politicians? Where are the police and the prosecutors and the judges? Oh yeah, they're lining their pockets. The disturbing reality is that little has been done and is being done by the Ukrainian government to put a stop to sex trafficking. And why? Because too much dirty money is at stake. Too much corruption in the corridors of power and in the offices of the prosecutors, in the chambers of judges, and in the orphanages themselves. So when you hear all this, we shake our heads in disgust, take a deep breath, and think, well, it can't get worse. Or can it? Well, it's far, far, far worse for children with mental and physical disabilities. For most of them, there's not even a hint of a future, no chance of a better life. There's nothing but a dark and bleak tunnel with absolutely no light at the end of it. From the very start of their sad lives on this planet, they are discarded and left to rot their childhood away in state-run institutions for what they call the incapacitated and what the government has labeled the imbecile. These children are deemed by the state to be irredeemable. They are blind, they are deaf, they are mentally challenged, and they are physically disabled. And when they age out, they're simply transferred to an old age home at 18 and 19, or a psychiatric institution where they fester until they die. So much unbelievable abuse, so much unbelievable damage to young lives that continues day in and day out, year after year in Ukraine. Sure, there are small rays of hope coming from the kindness and generosity of good, caring people, both inside and outside Ukraine, who try their best to save as many young souls as possible. And that is a good thing, and I applaud it. But the reality is that the vast majority of children in these institutions face a life of severe neglect and abuse. All children need love, they need protection, and the care of a family and a community. That is the only way they can grow into caring, responsible, productive, and loving adults. Countless studies have shown that children who are removed from their families and communities and institutionalized lose their ability to form emotional attachments as adults. So where does the blame lie? First and foremost, the government of Ukraine. The plight of these children, these precious young souls, these gifts from God, their hopes for the future has been brought to the attention of government leaders and ministry officials for decades. Yet all this shocking issue seems to get from political leaders is a lot of hot air. They make promises, they vow to shut down the institutions and establish community-based services and protections. They say they will support impoverished families to assist them in keeping children in their homes rather than abandoning them to the care of the state. They mouth these words and then very little is done. Now recently the Ombudsman, Mykola Kuleba, announced that the government is committed to shutting down internet, noting that Ukraine should focus its resources on preventing children from ever having to enter this system. Kuleba noted again that there's 109,000 children in care and only 8,000 are legitimate orphans, because so many of them come from broken homes, or where a father is in prison, or where a mother has disappeared into the vortex of who knows what, maybe sexual trafficking. The rest have parents who chose to put their children in care because they have no other option. They are simply too poor to take care of them. And if their child has a disability, the child has to go into an institution because there is no specialized support in the community. Kuleba was appointed the Ombudsman for Children by the President of Ukraine 3 years ago. He sees his mandate as reforming, quote, this crazy old Soviet system which kills children, and replacing it with community-driven programs aimed at supporting impoverished parents to keep and look after their children, setting up foster care networks and small group homes, all backed by trained social workers to make certain that at-risk children are protected and that crucial services are provided. In that 3-year period, Kuleba has put together a detailed national reform strategy for replacing the internet with a paid, and he's doing this with a paid staff. Guess how many? 3 people and 1 volunteer. Yeah, that's great that the president appointed him and gave him 3 people to work with and 1 volunteer. $240 million US annually is spent to run the internets, and that was in the year 2016. This is money wasted. In his financial analysis, he found that the main beneficiary of 85% of that money allocated to the system, the orphanage system, was the orphanage staff. The remaining 15% went to the children, which works out to $1 per day per child. $1 per day per child 87 cents for food and 3 cents for clothing. Wow, we spend. Kuleba concluded that the orphanage system is expensive and ineffective, and it's also brutal. And that's it, a plan and no political will to implement it. You know, they're looking at 2050 before they implement all of it and deinstitutionalize it. God, I'll be dead. And I don't believe it anyway. So I asked him, where's the major roadblock in this? Why isn't there political will to implement this? And he said, it's not the politicians, it's the directors and staff of the orphanages and the internats. And he says internats are a business, and keeping children in them is their business. Closing them down would mean losing their jobs. It doesn't matter whether it's a brutal system, whether it's an abusive system, but hey, my job is more important than the lives of these children. To this day, parents are forced to give up their children to internats because they are too poor to take care of them. Yet rather than helping impoverished children and families with a little financial help, the government allocates $240 million to the orphanage system. Rather than setting up foster care and group home networks, the government perpetuates a warehouse system. And the solutions are there, the political will is not. So, after this bleak, depressing, miserable account, you've got to wonder, what the hell? What the hell? Can this mess ever be fixed? I'm actually a very positive guy. I've given you the bad stuff, but I'll give you some of the good stuff. It can be fixed. But it can only be accomplished with serious political action and a commitment of the community. And what is happening in so many of these institutions to this very day demands immediate action to ensure the health, safety, and future of the children. Politicians need to get off their ample butts at the local, state, and national level and take immediate action to protect the lives of children in care of the state. Immediate action must be taken to shut down these institutions, what I call these monoliths of suffering. The government must take decisive action and a stand against any form of institutionalization for so-called normal children, and especially for those children who have mental and physical disabilities. They need supportive care in their communities, not being dumped and forgotten in some far-flung warehouse. Immediate action must be taken to support destitute families so they don't have to resort to abandoning their children on the doorsteps of orphanages. What must be kept foremost in mind is that children are the priority, not the institution, not the staff, not the directors. And they are a gift from God. They are truly the precious resource and Ukraine's hope for the future. Ukraine has lost, over these couple of decades, a huge swath of young people to exploitation and abuse suffered in the state-run orphanage system since that country gained independence in 1991. The government of Ukraine must recognize that this is a crisis and make resolving it a national priority before more children are lost to the dark side. And while so much is depressing and bleak, there are rays of hope. There are platoons of caring people, both in Ukraine and in the so-called diaspora, who are trying to do their little bit to lessen the suffering and improve the lives of children in orphanages. I know that when I hear people, when people hear the breadth and scope of this calamity, they get overwhelmed. They have no idea what they could possibly do to stop it. I don't live in a fairy tale world thinking that one human being can solve the myriad problems of the world. It is simply too huge and too daunting. But I have lived my entire adult life guided by this one important principle. If you can touch the soul of one unfortunate or suffering human being on the planet, then you've done something truly significant with your life. And let me give you an example. In this tiny wedge of the world, we have Nashi. It's made up of a dedicated team of volunteers who have heard the harrowing stories of Ukraine's orphans, especially girls being targeted for the sex trade. And they decided they had to do something about it. Around a kitchen table in Saskatoon, they came up with a plan and went at it with eyes wide open, knowing full well that they were not able or equipped to solve the big problem, but with the knowledge and commitment that they could make a difference in a very special way. The Nashi volunteers set out with one important guiding principle: to save some children, to touch the souls of some children by providing a safe haven, by giving them a place where they can grow, where they can live a healthy life free from neglect and abuse, where they can get a real education, and mostly where they can find love and get hugs, so that when they do graduate, they have a good chance of a good life as adults. Nashi, with one pierogi at a time, set out on an adventure of a lifetime. And with buckets of sweat and dogged determination, they built the Maple Leaf House. And to date, Nashi has rescued and taken in 13 vulnerable girls. And one day soon, the house will be home to, and I stress that word, home, to a maximum of 20 to 22 girls. Nashi's objective was never intended to solve the massive problem faced by the thousands of institutionalized children in Ukraine. Nashi was created to touch souls, created by caring individuals who wanted to do their little bit. And in my eyes, Nashi has become a beacon of hope, because what they've done in a tiny farming village as Stoyanov can be replicated in hundreds of villages in hundreds of different countries around the world. Nashi means our children, and all children around the world are our children. They are precious souls, they are our hope for the future, and they are truly a gift from God. And we should all be proud of the good work of Nashi and its volunteers. And pretty soon we're going to see an incredible documentary that shows you what they are doing. I want to thank you very much for listening to my rant. And I guess we're going to be calling up Andrew. Where's Andrew?
He's gone to start the film.
Oh, he's going to be starting this film.
Yes.
Here we go.